Hey everybody, Winston and Donna rolling with the halls. When I was in college, through a series of events I personally experienced, I became a believer in ghosts.
This video is going to be different than our other videos, but it's an important story to tell. So the last several weeks we've spent researching court documents and police records so that we get the story straight.
And the story you're about to hear is the tragic and somber tale of a beautiful young woman who lost her life too soon, and we tell the story with the utmost respect for her memory. If you ever had a paranormal experience, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I think this building's haunted. I'm hearing footsteps in the hall. We both hear a distant female voice. All of a sudden, I would be aware of this feeling that someone was just watching. We're on the campus of Angelo State University, my alma mater, where this story took place. Now, 20 years ago, I was a freshman here on campus and decided I wanted to be a cartoonist for the school newspaper, The Rampage. So I made my way to this building right here. I went upstairs and I found the Rampage office and I got to know everybody that works there. Well, after a while, I was hanging out there a lot. And one day, the editor, Chris, pulls me aside and asked me point blank, "Do you believe in ghosts?" And he looked at me deadpan and said, "If you hang around here long enough, you will believe in ghosts." And then he told me a story that to this day still gives me goosebumps. That day in the office, Chris reached up and pulled a bound book full of old Rampage copies, and he laid it out on the table. And he flipped to one particular page that had a glaring headline. He then proceeded to read the article and tell me the story about a young woman that was murdered in this building. On the evening of April 22nd, 1978, an 18-year-old freshman named Leandra Morales made her way across campus. Leandra was described by those who knew her as intelligent, beautiful, and quiet. That evening, she innocently went upstairs in the business administration building to do some schoolwork. As fate would have it, that night, an ROTC student and yearbook photographer named Robert Mark Wagner also went to the second floor of the building to work in the photo lab. He was described as organized and businesslike and kept a quiet, low profile. Around 8 p.m., they were both working in the photo lab. Leandra was seated at a desk while Robert was drawing some prints. They kissed, but when Robert kissed her neck, Leandra retaliated by slapping him. What happened next came straight out of the pages of a Hollywood horror film. Robert snapped, choking Leandra and striking her. Leandra, in a desperate attempt to save her own life, fought back, inflicting scratches on Robert's face and neck. In a fit of rage, Robert grabbed a pair of scissors nearby and stabbed Leandra 3 times. One of the stab wounds punctured her heart, ultimately killing her. With the knife still in her chest, Robert then dragged Leandra's body down the hall to room 200 near the elevator. He went downstairs and retrieved a copy of the Angelo State Rampage. He came back upstairs, pulled the bloody scissors from Leandra's chest, and wrapped them in the newspaper. On the way back to his dorm, he disposed of the scissors in a dumpster. After returning to the dorm, he called a priest and then the police. When police talked to him, Robert claimed he had found Leandra mortally wounded in room 200. But upon further investigation, his story unraveled, and he confessed to the murder. Robert Mark Wagner was formally charged with the murder of Leandra Morales, and on June 13, 1978, after a one-day trial, he was convicted of her murder and sentenced to 25 years confinement in the Texas Department of Corrections. While most college ghost stories are urban legends, are based on half-truths or totally unverifiable, the tale of Leandra Morales' murder is here in black and white for the whole world to see. We went to the Tom Green County Library and dug through their microfiche and found article after article describing how this murder rocked the city of San Angelo and had everyone in Angelo State terrified, including the very librarian that was helping us research this story, who was on campus the day after this happened. Since then, the story has permeated the world. I wrote about it when I was at the school newspaper, and so my name has floated all over the place. I've seen my name in the Des Moines Register. I've seen it, of course, at the Angelo State Rampage when they write follow-up articles, and I've even seen it in forward publications like in Mexico. I think all of us that worked at the Rampage connected with this story and with Leandra on a personal level because we were students like her. We worked in a building that she also was working in, and we all have our lives in front of us, our whole lives. And her only mistake was not returning romantic interest in someone who was interested in her. And who of us hasn't done that? The man who murdered Leandra Morales in cold blood was sentenced to 25 years in a Texas State Penitentiary. He was convicted in June of 1978. And it wasn't long after that the students who spent a lot of time in the Business Administration Building, which later was renamed the Hardeman Building, began to report strange things happening in the building. People quickly realized that the spirit of this beautiful young woman, Leandra Morales, might possibly still be in the building. After hearing the horrific, tragic story of Leandra, I knew if ever there was a building that would make me believe in ghosts, it would be this building. So a whole year went by. And honestly, I kind of forgot about the story of Leandra. I only came by the Rampage office during the day to drop off my cartoons I was drawing for them. I was never there at night. So this story was way back in the back of my head somewhere. So my sophomore year, my friend Julie was now the editor. And she and I were up at the Rampage late one night, maybe 11, 12 o'clock at night. We'd been working on the newspaper all night. Everybody had gone home but the two of us. And we're there in the Rampage office, in the editor's office, talking away. And we were alone in the building. And the thing about the Hardeman Building was, because of the hard floors and there's only 2 staircases to come upstairs, you knew when you were alone. When one of your friends would come up the stairs that made a lot of noise, oh, here comes so-and-so. So it was really easy to discern when you were alone in this building. And Julie and I absolutely were alone in this building. All of a sudden, we both hear a distant female voice. And it was loud enough and distinct enough that we both stopped mid-sentence. I turned back to Julie. You heard that, right? Yes, I heard it. We both got up to investigate. We went out to the Rampage office and then out into the hall and then up and down the hall, even downstairs, and the whole building was empty. We went back into our office and Julie said, I'm just going to pretend that never happened. And then sitting there, I remembered the warning from Chris a year earlier when he said, if you hang out here long enough, you will believe in ghosts. That night, my ideas about the paranormal and the possible existence of ghosts started to change. After Julie and I heard the voice, the distant voice down the hall, I started spending more and more time at the Rampage. I was writing stories for them. I became a staff writer and was spending lots of time there. In my junior year, I ended up becoming the managing editor of the paper, which meant I was there all the time, late into the night. And what I tell people when they ask, what is it like to work in a building that might be haunted? It's really hard to explain what I'm about to tell you, but this is the best way I can do it. There were nights when I would end up being the last person there. And of course your mind plays tricks on you because you believe you're in a building that a spirit is also hanging out in. And so you try to put on headphones and just go about your normal business. And I was really good at distracting myself. So I would be typing on a computer, just working away. And this happened a lot. All of a sudden, I would be aware of this feeling that someone was just watching me. I'm getting goosebumps. This is 20 years later. That feeling of being alone in a building and having someone just stare at you. You know it. You've been in public when you felt somebody staring at you and you glanced over and saw them staring at you. Imagine that, but there's no one there. And more than once, I got that feeling. And it creeped me out so bad that whatever work I had left to do, I didn't do it. I would just shut it down and jog, a slow jog to the front door to leave that building.
What you have to remember about this time frame was that most of us didn't have cell phones, so things were very different. So the Rampage office up on the second floor, we worked late at night and the building was always locked and only 2 people had keys. So if you didn't have a key and you needed to get into the building and you didn't have a cell phone, there was only one way to get everybody's attention, and that was to throw a pebble at the window. So one night I got here late and needed to get into the office, and I came around to this side of the building, picked up a pebble and threw it at the window. My friend Keely heard the pebble hit the window and she peeked outside and saw me down here. Now the thing about this building is there are 2 doors you come in, one on the east, one on the west. And so when you were on the sidewalk, you simply pointed to the door you were going to. Well, that night I pointed this direction and Keely signaled she would meet me at that door. I got to this spot right here where I was feet away from rounding the corner of the building, and I heard the handicap door button click and the door start to open. It's a very distinct sound. Around in the corner of the building, and I see the door opening. It had just started to open, and there was nobody inside. I assumed that Keely opened the door, so I go inside, and I make my way about halfway up the stairs, and I meet Keely coming down the stairs, and she looks surprised to see me and asks, "How did you get in the building?" I said, "I thought you opened it." She said, "I just got here." A moment passed, and we both realized we didn't know who or what had opened the door.
So, you've got to understand the geography of the Hardeman Building. Where Leandra was stabbed was the room right next door to the Rampage office, which was now a radio booth. And it shared a wall with the Rampage. And there was a Ram radio show. I was a DJ for a while. My friend Andy was a DJ. Well, at night, they would have the radio program playing on a computer, and there was nobody manning the booth. So one night we're working in the Rampage and typing away, and in the radio booth, which is like the next, just right there, next room over, all of a sudden the music comes on loud, as if it was turned all the way up. Every knob was cranked and the wall was vibrating. It was so loud. And everybody in the office is just looking and like, what in the world is going on over there, you know? And then after about 2 or 3 minutes, the music just cut off. That was weird, and we forgot about it. The next day, I asked the radio producer, who would have been in charge of what was going on that night, I said, what in the world happened at Ram Radio last night? He said, what do you mean? And we explained to him the music blasting at 10 o'clock at night. He said, there's no reason for that. He said, that's computers all automated. It's not even on in the studio. It's through a computer system that goes out to the broadcast. There's no reason why any music should be heard in the radio room. And yet, inexplicably, for 3 minutes, it was on full blast that night. One thing that always happened up there was the elevator. Now, the Hardeman Building was only 2 stories tall, so the elevator went up and down, floor 1, floor 2. And the elevator in the Hardeman Building had this very bizarre habit of going up and down on its own all night. You know the sound, ding! It's a very noticeable sound. And we would all be in the Rampage office, again, working away, and we would hear this elevator ding, ding, door open. Of course, nobody's there. It happened so often that eventually we just joked about it. Oh, it's the elevator going up and down. So one day, I'm rounding the corner. This is the middle of the day. It's like the school day. And I come across an elevator technician working on the elevator. And it's like he's got all the buttons out and the guts of the elevator, wires everywhere. And I made a comment to him offhand. I said, oh, I see you're finally fixing the elevator. I said, is it because it goes up and down on its own all the time? And this guy, who works in elevators for a living, looked totally confused. And he said something like, oh, no, I'm just doing routine maintenance. And he said, what do you mean it goes up and down on its own? I said, well, I work here late at night. And I said, this elevator always goes up and down. In the middle of the night, ding, door opens. There's nobody coming or going in this building. There's like 4 or 5 of us up here working. And the elevator door will open and go up and down. He said, that's impossible. I said, no, of course it's possible. I said, I've seen it happen. He said, no, it doesn't happen. I said, look, buddy, I have personally witnessed the elevator go up and down on its own. And he finally interrupted me and he corrected me. And he says, it doesn't go up and down on its own. Someone has to push the button. I got the goosebumps all over me. He said, this elevator does not operate independent of corporal influence. Somebody has to manipulate this button to bring the elevator up or bring the elevator down. He said, I promise you, it doesn't go anywhere on its own. Obviously, by this point, you can understand why I was really starting to firmly believe that the Hardeman Building at Angelo State was haunted. There were just too many of these bizarre occurrences that had absolutely no explanation. And believe it or not, things got worse. Now, the second floor of the Hardeman Building at night was a beehive of activity. On one side, you had the Rampage offices where I spent most of my time. The Rampage had another office across the hall we used. Next door to that was a TV lab and a studio where broadcast journalism students would be editing projects. So in the evenings, like 5 or 6 to maybe 9 or 10, there was a lot of people up there and a lot of activity. And the TV lab especially had, TVs were on and computers and all kinds of stuff going on. And so it was a very busy place. But after about 9 or 10, when the TV lab closed, is when the Rampage people would still be there and things would quiet down a little. So the Rampage people weren't the only ones experiencing these paranormal things happening. The TV lab was a hotspot for all this stuff happening, and things that I saw personally. When I was working on my projects in the TV lab, I saw with my own eyes TVs that would just go off and then come back on and then go off and then come back on. I've never had a TV that just went off and on its own all the time. And it was a regular occurrence in that TV lab for electrical equipment to just do its own weird little thing. And everybody would kind of, shrug it off, say, oh, that was weird. But I knew better. So my friend Chris, different Chris than the editor of the newspaper, he worked in the TV lab. And it was his job to close the lab down at night. So he would tell everybody working on their projects, hey, I'm leaving in 10 minutes. Whatever you got, give it to me. If he had a project due, in those days it was a VHS tape. And he'd gather them up. And his job was to take them into Pat Turner's office. And Pat was a professor, a TV studio broadcast journalism professor. And she had a locked office. And it was Chris's job to take finished products, put them in her office, and lock the door. So late one Friday night, Chris is working in the TV lab. Now here's what you have to understand about the way this side of the hallway was set up, because it'll help you visualize the story. There was the main TV lab, which had all the editing equipment. That's where all the students spent all their time working. Joining that room was Pat Turner's office. And then next to her office was the TV studio. And there was a window in her office where you could see into the studio, but there was no door. So to get from the TV lab to the studio, you had to walk out into the hallway, down the hallway, into the studio. That's an important part of the story. So on this particular Friday night, Chris gathers up all the projects, he kicks everybody out, he's closing up. He puts the projects on Pat Turner's desk, turns off the light, closes the door. So now all he has left to do is go out into the hallway, down to the hall to the studio, and turn the studio lights off. So he does that, no problem. Turns the lights off, locks the door, into the hallway, back into the lab to do one last sweep before he shuts everything up. And he sees below the door that the light is on in Pat Turner's office. The light he had just turned off. And I'm sure if it was me, I would be thinking, maybe I forgot to turn the light off. Highly possible. No big deal. So Chris goes over there, gets out his key, unlocks the door, opens her office, and flicks off the light. When he turns her light off in the dark office, he can see clearly through the window into the TV studio. And the lights in there that he definitely had just turned off were back on. I'm sure he was spooked. He turns Pat Turner's light off. He locks her door again for the second time. He walks into the hallway again. He walks into the TV studio, turns those lights off again. Comes into the hall, back down to the hall, and when he gets to the TV lab, he sees once more that the light is on in Pat Turner's office. This time, definitely not a mistake. That light was off, and now it's back on. So Chris, braver than me, he goes over there, unlocks the door, and turns the light off. He looks into the studio. Those lights stay off this time. But he hears a door in the dark studio slam shut. Slam! Bang! He was done. He closes Pat Turner's office up, takes off out of there. The next Monday, remember that was a Friday night, so it's closed all day Saturday, all day Sunday. Monday morning, I was there for this. I witnessed this personally. I was in the Rampage office, and I hear a scream across the hall. Pat Turner screaming. I run over there, and she had just tried to open the office door and discovered that a photo, which had been hanging on the wall behind her desk, was on the floor, propped up against the closed door from the inside, so that when she tried to open it, the photograph was leaning, the framed photograph was leaning against the door. It's a sequence of events with multiple witnesses. The lights going on and off, the photo being in the wrong spot, Chris right in the middle of all of it, and then me there to see it. Now, you would think that would be the end of the story, but we went back to the Hardeman Building to research this video and discovered that all of that area of the second floor had been remodeled, no longer a TV studio or anything. It's all administrative offices. And I talked to an employee whose desk is very near where all this happened. And she told me that there is a canvas painting in that office that to this day has a tendency to end up on the floor with no explanation. I remember one night in particular, again, I was the managing editor. We were up there on a deadline night, which meant the paper was mostly supposed to be done by that night. So we were always, of course, running behind because we were college students. So many times we would stay up till 2 or 3 in the morning. One night we were all up there working, frantically typing and designing our pages, and the phones started ringing. The phones in the office started ringing. 4 or 5 of them, all at once. Ring, ring, ring. Of course, somebody would answer. Rampage. Nobody on the phone. Not a dial tone, just dead air. Now, it wasn't uncommon to get phone calls. It was an office, but especially late at night, if the phone rang, it was usually somebody you were expecting to call. Well, this night, the phone rang, nobody was there, hung up. 2 minutes later, phone rings again. Rampage, no answer. Put it back down. 30 seconds later, phones ring. Rampage. Well, at this point, everybody's starting to get a little weirded out because the phones don't ring like that. Okay, once in a night, maybe twice, but never 3 times in a row with nobody there. And I don't remember the exact number, but the phone kept ringing. It kept ringing so often that those of us who at that point had gotten cell phones were holding them up, putting them on the table, raising our hands because everyone thought someone else was playing a practical joke. But every time the phone was answered, and I answered it one time, there was nothing there. Just dead air, as if the phone hadn't even been picked up off the hook. Absolutely freaking everybody out. Finally, as an absolute last resort, I decided to speak to Leandra directly, out loud, for the whole room to hear. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I said, Leandra, we know it's you, and it's funny, you got us good. You got us real good. But we have work to do, and it's kind of scaring us a little bit. So if you just knock off the playing with the phones, we would appreciate it greatly. And I swear to you, hand on a Bible, those phones did not ring again the whole night. We called the phone company the next day and said, do phones ever just randomly ring for no reason? The phone company said, no way. They've got to be manipulated. A call's got to come through. Called the electric company and said, was there any kind of weird electrical charge or overcharge, something that would have caused the phones to ring wildly? And they said, nothing happened last night. Totally normal. To this day, I have no explanation for what made those phones ring all night, except it had to be our friend Leandra. By now, after being in the Rampage office on and off for 3 years, I was entirely convinced that ghosts exist. No sane person could see the things that we had seen and experience the things we'd experienced and not believe that something otherworldly was hanging out in the Hardeman Building. And I say that with all the depths of my belief possible. Someone was there with us in that building. And finally, one night, something happened that sent me completely over the edge, that for the rest of my life, when people say, do you believe in ghosts? I shoot my hand up in the air and say, I believe in ghosts. And it was this one final thing that happened to me and my friends that was so impossible to ignore. It was just unbelievable what happened. We were all up there one night working. Now, I mentioned earlier the Rampage had 2 offices, the main office, and then across the hall we had a little secondary office, which is where our printer was. So anytime we would print off the big proof sheets for the newspaper, they'd print across the hall. So we were constantly making trips back and forth across the hall. So one night I was in the office across the hall, working on something, and I heard distinctly the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Click, 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 click. Now I gotta preface this by saying, as humans, we have an auditory response system. When you hear a noise, you react to it. It's so instinctual, you don't even think about it. But when they make robots that react to noises, they have to write software for the robots to create that response to auditory input. So when I'm sitting in an office, minding my own business, typing or whatever I was doing, and I hear footsteps, that's triggering nerves in my brain that create this response to, what am I hearing? I'm hearing footsteps in the hallway, like 20 feet away. So I did what any normal person would do at 11 o'clock at night. I stuck my head in the hallway to see who was coming up to the Rampage office. And of course, nobody there. Hallway is totally empty. Okay, I know the drill. I think this building's haunted. I probably just heard Leandra's footsteps in the hallway. I go back to working, and maybe 5 minutes later, it happens again. And this time I said, I am most definitely 100% for sure hearing footsteps. And I poked my head out the door, and Brandon, staff writer for the Rampage, at the same time poked his head out of the door across the hallway. So both of us are poking our heads into the hallway to see who was walking down the hallway. And I looked over at Brandon and I said, you heard that. You heard that, didn't you? And his exact response was, ugh. And he just turned and went back into the Rampage office. So I thought that was going to be the culmination of events that night, but boy was I wrong. Finally, 1 or 2 in the morning, we were almost done. We're working away, trying to finish our deadline. And Stacy, who was now the editor of the Rampage, goes across the hall to get a piece of paper she printed. We hear, there were like 6 of us up there. All of us heard this insanely loud crash. Kaboom! Noise, crash, crash, scream. Blood-curdling scream. And of course we all jump up to go run over there to see what in the world had happened. And Stacy just comes out of the door with tears pouring down her face. Obviously, like, she's pale. Obviously she has just witnessed something terrifying. Goes over to the office, grabs her purse, grabs her keys, and leaves. We go in the little side office where she had been. And there were newspapers all over the floor. It looked like something from a horror movie or The Shining or Poltergeist, one of those kind of movies. There were just newspapers everywhere. Now, we kept in that office the archived, back copies of the paper. They're like maybe 10 or 20 of every past issue from the year, and they're all on a shelf. And they're organized by week, so that if somebody needs one of the old copies, we just go across the hall and grab it. Well, the papers that were on the floor had come from one of those stacks. But here's the thing. The stack of papers was in the middle of the shelf, in the middle of all these other papers. And, we were thinking, well, they could have fallen off. But no, this entire stack of papers, down to the very last one, were off the shelf as if someone had just pushed them. And boy, all of us were just totally, completely freaked out by that. When we asked Stacy about it later, she said out of the corner of her eye, she just saw newspapers flying into the air. Just flying. That night, it was done. It was sold. I was a believer. And I believe Leandra Morales was still in that building. And that she was trying to get our attention or just playing with us, but for whatever reason, she was there in that building. This wasn't a folk tale or an urban legend. This was real life. It doesn't get any more real than the things we witnessed in that building. Now, all these years later, when I reflect about the fact that it might have been Leandra, and how young and beautiful she was, and how tragic her death was, I would have been more on the side of curiosity, but when you're 19 or 20 years old, it was just abject fear of encountering this thing that you knew was watching you, that wasn't of this world. It was terrifying. Here's the crazy thing to me. Leandra was 18 years old when she died. Today, she would be 61 years old. And we're still talking about her. When her spirit stayed behind in that building and she made herself known, she was telling her story. If I hadn't heard footsteps, and if people hadn't heard or seen what they had seen, we never would have dug into her story or examined her existence at all. But because she made herself known, here we are talking about her. So ultimately, we'll call this a ghost story, but it's so much more than that. It is a human story. And we tell it to honor the life of Leandra Morales. And my only hope for Leandra is that wherever she is right now, she finally found the peace she was always looking for.